We are delighted once again to have Danielle DiMartino Booth, founder and CEO of QI Research, on with us to talk about the economy, to talk about a lot of new things that are coming up that are going to be of concern to Fed Chair Powell, who's on the Hill today. Delighted to have Danielle. And I think, Danielle, aren't congratulations in order? I think you just recently celebrated your 10th anniversary for QI Research.
Yes, it's hard to believe that in June of 2015 I walked out of the Federal Reserve. And boy, that was a great day. But no, 10 years later, I'm delighted that we're still publishing every day.
You didn't even take a break. You walked out of the Federal Reserve and started QI Research.
I did. I published I literally published 5 days after leaving. I published my flagship first weekly quill. I don't know why I'm remembering right now because I haven't thought about it in years, but it was called the Great Abdication. It was Congress abdicating its responsibility to the Federal Reserve and not making, not making fiscal policy to grow the private economy. So here we sit 10 years later, and gee, so much has changed.
It has, hasn't it? Now, I wanted to actually move to something you posted about a lot this morning on X, which is warn notices. And you posted quite a few warn notices, which if you could just tell the audience what warn notices are briefly.
Sure. And the reason we're following WARN notices is because they're running at the fastest pace since the Great Recession, 2007 to 2009, nationwide in the aggregate. But the reason we aggregate the numbers is because WARN notices are it is the minutia of economic data. If a company knows in most states, let's say, that they're going to be laying off 100 employees or more, then again, every state has slightly different laws, but most states require companies to file a warn notice with them such that employees are given 60, 90 days of warning prior to losing their jobs so that they can plan for the future. And again, when you aggregate these warn notices, we really are seeing them at the highest level. And that means that whether you're talking about a plant closure that affects 321 individuals, that was one of the warnings that I posted this morning, but I posted 7 different ones from really various distinct industries. There's not a theme here. This isn't late 2023 when Amazon starts this trend in Silicon Valley and it's laying off middle managers and it's kind of isolated to one geographic area and overhiring during the pandemic. That's not what we're seeing in the WARN notices. We're seeing distinct geographic cutbacks, headcount reductions, and we're seeing it across many different industries with, ironically, Michigan leading of all states, right? Michigan after Nevada has the highest state unemployment rate. And we saw the highest number of initial jobless claims coming out of Michigan. That's not exactly what President Trump, that's not how the script he's written should be reading, because he is, when he was campaigning up to the presidential election, he was talking about creating jobs in manufacturing. And we're seeing the exact opposite of that occur.
I noticed a couple of things that you posted really drew my attention. One was Hyatt taking out 30% of their service people. Maybe I don't want to stay at Hyatt. If I have an issue, it might be a little difficult to get help. And then the other one that struck me, and the word that you use, it was certainly striking, is career builder and monster. File for bankruptcy. And I don't know the story behind it, but you said that their business was shriveling, and these people are sort of help you to hunt for jobs. So it seems to suggest that not so many jobs are available.
It's interesting you raise that point because obviously we live in a different world than when Monster and Career Builder first came to be. There's obviously more people who look to LinkedIn or Indeed.com. But seeing that big Chapter 11 filing this morning, I looked at the Indeed.com job postings, and they're indexed to basically the advent of this explosion in hiring that we saw after the economy reopened in 2021. And the index now is at 105, meaning we're just within a whisper of falling all the way back, of getting rid of all of the excess demand for labor that we saw in the post-pandemic era, unwinding that. And typically what we see, we call it reversion to the mean. I know you know exactly what I'm talking about, but typically when we have a reversion to the mean, we also end up correcting more to the downside before there's a stabilization. And I think that that's exactly what we are experiencing. Countless US companies are suffering margin squeezes. It's not that the tariffs don't exist, it's that there's an inability to pass along higher prices, higher input costs to consumers because there's simply not enough money. We have record numbers of Americans working multiple jobs. We've got record number of Americans working in the gig economy, which does not pay benefits for the most part. And so in this type of an environment, aggregate income begins to decline. And that means that companies don't have pricing power because consumers don't have purchasing power.
TransUnion, the credit agency, is reporting that for I guess for the pandemic, people didn't have to pay their school loans for a long time,
More
but
than
now
five
it's
years.
time to
Yes.
right, which perhaps is too long, but now it seems to be time to pay the piper. They're reporting that 2 million American, I guess who owe these loans to the government, or would be 270 days past due, so they're in default, and they're going to get their pay docked. I think there's 2 million in July and more in August and September, and the dock could be 15%, which seems like I don't think a lot of these folks, if they're not already paying their loans, I don't think they have 15% to be done. I mean, that's going to come out of somewhere. It seems like it's a big number.
It's an effective pay cut, isn't it? And as we know from the Department of Education, wage garnishments do start this summer, and they anticipate that by the end of September, that a total of 9 million Americans will be at least 270 days delinquent on their student loans. A good friend of mine, John Comiskey, does extraordinarily great analysis at the intersection of Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, FHA, VA mortgages, government-backed mortgages, but he does good work at the intersection of mortgagors and student loan borrowers. And his back of the envelope, and I say that tongue in cheek because he's done meticulous calculations, but from a starting point, if the big beautiful bill passes in its current form as it pertains to student loan borrowers and further restrictions on extending and pretending government-backed mortgages, he thinks that by the time we get to the beginning of 2026, there'll be 4.8 million Americans with government-backed mortgages that are going to be facing a large income shock due to those student loan repayments. So the reason I bring this up, Tai, is that because we cannot look at student loans and how they're going to affect U.S. household budgets in isolation. We have to consider them in conjunction with the fact that so many Americans in recent years have taken on mortgages where before they were living in city centers and they were renters. They've taken on auto payments for the first time because they moved outside of city centers, and they've racked up buy now, pay later, but much more to a much greater extent, credit card debt. So they've got to juggle all of the debt service. That was one of the extraordinary takeaways from 2024 is that on whole, in the aggregate, Americans were spending more to service their non-mortgage household debt than they were to service their mortgages. We'd never seen this in the history of the United States. But what that tells you is there's a lot more non-recourse debt that's sitting out there than there was 5 years ago. Millions upon millions of student loan borrowers have been operating under the assumption that they would never have to pay these loans back. So this is what we call a classic income shock. And it's, TransUnion figures that on average FICO scores have dropped by 60 points. But when it comes to higher income individuals, and I always use the example of an oral surgeon, the average oral surgeon in the United States has $469,000 of student debt. But when it comes to higher income earning Americans, that income shock is going to be appreciably bigger, and the hit to their FICO score could be up to 150, 200 points. So this is real economic nuts and bolts that we're talking about that, by the way, Chair Powell knows exist.
So, if let's put you in the seat of the Fed chair, and hey, maybe that would be a nice next
It's a
gig
hot
for you.
seat, Ty.
I dare say that it will probably pay less. The Fed chair would pay less than what you do as CEO of QI Research. But where do you think the Fed funds rate ought to be at this stage in the cycle right now?
So I think that it's pretty apparent that because the Fed funds rate is above so many other benchmarks, that I think we're at least 100 basis points, one full percentage point away from where we should be at this juncture. Now, I need to be really clear because I get a lot of flack on what we used to call Twitter because Danielle wants to go back to the zero bound. She wants to restart quantitative easing, money printer go burr. No, I don't. I think that the Fed funds rate new floor should be 2% and never should it be breached again. And I don't agree that quantitative easing should ever be started up again. I think they're both abject failures that encourage speculation and have proven to be kind of a non-starter when you're talking about the real economy. So I need to be very clear that I believe the Fed funds rate is too high, but I don't think that it should fall much more than 200 basis points in total in any economic downturn.
That makes sense. It's sort of, let's get away from the sort of the bad habits. Like people who've had bad habits, like, oh, we won't have to pay our student loans ever, so we'll go and take on some more debt and service those, and then eventually the piper comes calling, which seems like we're going to do in the next quarter or so. Um, staying with the Fed for a little bit, and there's been talk about having about Trump appointing a successor to Powell, like almost a year before he's due to go. And that seems sort of like perhaps not the best idea, but just to have sort of a shadow Fed chair. But what are you thinking? It seems like, is it between the Kevins, Kevin Hassett of, formerly of AEI, now in the administration, and Kevin Warsh, who, maybe a bit more of a hawk than Trump thinks he'll be.
So there's a lot going on here. The thing that I would say is on the side of the markets is that Trump likes to take his time making any decision. I'm going to be announcing X, Y, and Z in 2 days, and 48 hours later, make that 2 weeks, and two
Yeah.
weeks later, make that 2 months. So I think he loves to play cat and mouse with the media. What people are not talking about is the fact that Adriana Kugler's term ends on the Federal Reserve Board in January.
Hmm.
So whether he wants to name a potential shadow Fed chair tomorrow or wait until the last minute before Powell's term as chair is up come May, he's gonna have to announce somebody in the fall to to come after Adriana Kugler and fill that position. And that's the fact. So you're right, though. There's a certain irony in the fact that there's reams of opinion pieces and papers that Kevin Warsh has written that they're very much against quantitative easing. He does believe that's a failure. He doesn't believe in the zero bound. And maybe somebody's going to be whispering in President Trump's ear. He might not be your guy. Maybe it is Kevin Hassett. We will see. Maybe it's going to be Scott Bessent. But Scott Bessent surely wouldn't be raising his hand to take Powell's position if it was going to be a demotion effectively to step down from being Treasury Secretary of the United States to being on the Federal Reserve Board. He would only have that be a lateral move if he's still in the running, and then we're talking about next May. Regardless, by January, Congress is going to be voting on confirming somebody to replace an individual for a 14-year term on the Federal Reserve Board. That's a big decision for Trump to make because you leave longer lasting impacts on the Federal Reserve Board and on its leadership when you appoint someone to a new 14-year term.
Certainly. I mean, I think that's a really good insight. In terms of, and you think that, the Fed governors aren't like the Fed presidents. I think the Fed, presidents of different places actually, make a pretty decent living, but the Fed governors are, limited. They probably make $200,000 a year. And, a lot of people are like, do I really want to do that? And certainly, I think the market might not be happy if Bessent were to go and not be Treasury Secretary, because then who's going to be Treasury Secretary?
Right. No, and that's the catch 22 here is that, I think if market players, if long-term market veterans had their druthers, they would just clone Scott Bessent and call it a day, and they'd keep him in both positions because he is considered to be a very level-headed, calm, thoughtful leader, and you want that person to be Treasury Secretary, and you want that person to be chair of the Fed. So we'll have to wait and see. But I do think somebody like a Kevin Hassett, I think somebody like a Christopher Waller is also clearly an individual. He was chosen by Trump. We forget that initially, appointed to the Federal Reserve Board. Trump could certainly pick him from within if he chose to do so. But again, I will reiterate, Waller was the first one to come out when he was first appointed to the Federal Reserve Board and say, why are we conducting mortgage-backed securities, QE? Why are we easing in the housing and credit markets? That's not our business. That's not our place. So he would not be advocating for the most dovish of behaviors as chair of the Fed. And again, I don't think that these are very open secrets, Tai. I think somebody's going to be whispering in his ear. And if I'm Trump and I want somebody who is going to advocate for everything that I criticize, QE, the zero bound, blah, 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 you want to appoint a malleable yes man or yes woman to do your bidding. And again, we don't want that as head of the Fed anyways. It's the Supreme Court has just carved out effectively in its ruling the Fed's independence and indemnified that. We need to maintain that.
Absolutely, for the confidence that we need in our financial system, with all the things that all the concerns about long U.S. bonds and debt. Well, certainly a steady hand at the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve itself is. And you make a very, very good point. Well, thank you so much for being with us today. Look forward to speaking again very, very soon.
Absolutely, Tai. I always enjoy our discussions. Thank you for having me.